Pray with me. Holy Spirit, come. Be in my speaking and in our hearing, to the honor and glory of Jesus' name. Amen. Somewhere around the year 30 A.D., Jesus and his disciples were preaching the good news of the arrival of God's kingdom against the backdrop of the Roman Empire and their occupying forces. You could say it was the best of times and the worst of times. And because Jesus, in our gospel reading for today, is traveling from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to Mount Gerizim in Samaria, we could call today's reading a tale of two mountains. A long time ago, in a place far away, there lived a woman. She was pretty much your average woman, except she'd been married 5 times. We don't know her name. I wish we did. And we don't know how old she was, but if you figure on average 5 years per husband, with a marriage at 15 the first time, by the time the story takes place, she's at least in her early 40s. And I mention this because for some reason in my mind's eye I always pictured her as young, but she wasn't. She was most likely old enough to be Jesus' mother. And she felt older, tired, and worn out. This woman lived in the city of Sychar in Samaria, known today as the West Bank. It's a hard-scrabble land, mountainous, rocky, and dry. And she lived not far from Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritans worshipped, and not far from Jacob's well. For the women in her neighborhood, the daily trip to the well was the highlight of the day. The women spent most of their time working in the extended family compound, so to speak, but once a day they went out and traveled partway up the mountain to get to that well to get water. And as they went, they met neighbors and laughed and talked and caught up on the latest news and how's Aunt Mary and how are the kids? And because it was hot and the water jugs were heavy, the women went to the well first thing in the morning when it was cool. But not this particular woman. She never went in the morning. She wasn't welcome. I mean, 5 husbands. At the very best, that was a very long streak of really bad luck. I mean, if only one of those marriages had ended in divorce, and we don't know that any of them did, but if only one had, she would have been socially unacceptable. But no matter, at this point, she was living with a man she wasn't married to. She was no longer welcome among respectable people. She was shunned by the women of the town. She came to the well in the heat of the day, at noon, so she wouldn't have to hear their words or look into their accusing eyes. In a way, after all these years, she kind of liked having a little time to herself. It gave her time to think. And she was glad that even as bad as things were, at least she still had her health. She wasn't begging for money at the city gate, and she'd never had to be a prostitute. And sometimes as she walked up the path to Jacob's well, she thought about the ancestors who had walked that path before her. Jacob, the patriarch, the one they called Israel, whose name means he wrestles with God. She could relate to that. Standing in the place where Israel stood, she sometimes wrestled with God herself. And there were his sons, Joseph and Benjamin and Judah, all 12 of the brothers and their families. Some people said even Abraham had walked those paths. When she thought about all the generations that had gone before, she felt proud. Proud to be a Samaritan. I mean, she may not have been the most upstanding person in the world, but she was a good and loyal Samaritan. On another mountain in Jerusalem, Jesus had just finished having a long talk with a Pharisee named Nicodemus. And like the woman, Nicodemus had walked up a mountain alone at a strange hour, not wanting to be seen. And in his own way, he too was wrestling with God. Jesus had talked with him and done his best to answer the unasked questions, and now Jesus was tired and he wanted to go home to Galilee. And so the next day, he and the disciples got together and headed northward. And after a long morning of walking, exhausted and hungry, the disciples went to get a bite to eat while Jesus sat down by a well. That day, just like any other day, the woman of Sychar arrived at the well around noon. She saw a strange man sitting there. This was not good, because everybody knew that a woman, a decent woman, would never be caught traveling alone. This was dangerous. Who was this guy? What was he going to do? So she thought, think fast. But it was too late. He'd already seen her. There was nothing for it but to get the water as fast as she could and get out of there. And if he was a decent man, he'd ignore her, pretend she wasn't there. But no such luck. Give me some water, he said. No please, no hi, how are you? Just a demand from a man who, judging by his accent, had no business making any demands of a Samaritan, which she figured she better remind him. She said, how is it that a Jew like you is asking for a drink from a Samaritan woman like me? If the conversation had taken place in our time, she might have said, hon, do you know who you're talking to? Because that's exactly what Jesus heard. And that's the question he answered. He said, if you knew who you were talking to, you would ask him for water, living water, the gift of God. Really? That was a daring answer. This was a daring conversation to begin with. This guy's unconventional. He says curious things. She kind of liked him. And even though he was old enough to be her, or young enough to be her son, there was something about him that she respected. Sir, she said, using the Greek word Kyrie, like in Kyrie eleison, meaning Lord. Kyrie, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. How, where are you going to get this living water? And she couldn't resist the temptation to poke at him a little bit, reminding him of exactly which mountain he was currently sitting on. Are you greater than our father Jacob, whose well this is? He said, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water I give will never thirst again. The water I give will become on the inside of them a spring of living water welling up to eternal life. What was he going on about? She wondered. But suddenly she felt very thirsty, thirsty for hope, thirsty for something to believe in. So she decided to go for it and ask what he invited her to ask. Kyrie, give me this water so I'll never be thirsty or come here to draw again. He said, go call your husband and come back. And those words cut like a knife. Why? Why did he have to ask that? The conversation had been going so well. She'd actually begun to feel like he respected her a little bit. Why was it that every time something important needed to be talked about, a man would push the woman aside and insist on talking to another man? She could barely contain her rage as she spat out the words, I'm not married. 3 words. No Kyrie. Well said, Jesus said. Well said. You've had 5 husbands, and now the man you have is not your husband, which you've said is true. She could feel the rocks shifting like sand under her feet. Who is this man? How did he know? And wait, he knows this and he's not going anywhere? He's still talking to me? Kyrie, I can see that you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped here on this mountain, but you Jews say we have to worship in Jerusalem. What's up with that? It wasn't a dodge. For starters, the husband situation was old news as far as she was concerned, and if Jesus could live with it, so could she. Secondly, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I mean, if you had the chance to ask one question of a famous man of God, like Billy Graham or maybe C.S. Lewis, would you ask him how to improve your married life? Or would you ask the one burning question that nobody else has been able to answer? And besides that, she was giving Jesus the opportunity to show what he was really made of. Would he put her people down? Or would he speak words of peace? So she asked the number one question in her mind, what is it that God really requires of us? Good question. Apparently Jesus thought so too. So he explained how, even though salvation is from the Jews, the time is coming, and indeed had come, when neither mountain would be the place to worship, because people would worship God who is spirit and in truth. And in the deepest part of her soul, the woman knew this was right. It was the answer she'd been looking for, even if she didn't quite understand it. So she said, I know Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he will explain it all. And he said, I am he. And their eyes met, and she looked into the human face of God. She forgot all about the water jug. Jesus never got his drink. But the woman became the first person that Jesus ever told straight out that he was the Messiah. Her message was welcomed with joy by the people of her city. She was no longer an outcast. And the Samaritans, who would never have offered the Jews a glass of water, hosted Jesus and the disciples in their homes for 2 days. And Jesus and the disciples did what good Jewish boys would never have done. They accepted the invitation. And she never stopped talking about the day she met Jesus. The epilogue to our story can be found in the other readings for today. In our Old Testament reading, the people of Israel quarrel with God over the need for water. Like Jacob and like the woman, they too wrestle with God. All these people have one thing in common. None of them lets go of God until they receive the blessing. For us also, Lent may be a time of wrestling with God. If so, hang on and don't let go until the blessing comes, because it will come. That's what Paul promises in the reading from Romans. We have peace with God, not of our own doing, but through him. Through him we are justified. Through him we have peace. Through him we have grace. Through him we are reconciled to God. Through him. We do hear the words, I am he, one more time, on yet another mountain, the Mount of Olives. Jesus says to them, Jesus says them to Judas and the mob that come to arrest him, and at these words, they fall to the ground. I am he, the ancient name of God. I am. There is indeed power in that name. The testimony. is ours.